Hello and welcome to Frost Over the World. Later in the programme, the ice-cool British actress Kristen Scott Thomas, the ousted president of the Maldives, and the imminent US trial of 9/11 mastermind Khaled Sheikh Mohammed. But we begin with Bahrain. Inspired by the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, Bahrainis took to the streets more than a year ago, calling for greater political rights. Hundreds of Bahrainis camped in Pearl Roundabout in Manama, which immediately became the symbol of the movement. Over a year on, and in spite of the controversial Formula One Grand Prix going ahead, there are still endless reports of torture, detentions, employment dismissals, and very long prison sentences. One case that has come to international attention is that of the prominent activist and founder of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja. He is currently on the 79th day of a hunger strike at a military hospital in Bahrain. Joining me to discuss his case, as well as the ongoing discontent in Bahrain, is his daughter, Maryam al-Khawaja, also of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. Maryam, welcome. First question, obviously, is, as far as you're aware, today or yesterday, how is your father?
We actually don't know. Since Sunday afternoon, which was the last time he called, we haven't had any kind of access to him, whether by visitation or by phone calls. Nobody has been allowed to see him or talk to him, whether we're talking about the lawyer or the Danish ambassador or family members. And we're very, very worried because when my mother called the military hospital to ask about my father and his whereabouts, the nurse there told her that he was no longer in his room. And when she asked about his whereabouts, she told her to ask the Ministry of Interior. Both the Bahrain Defense Force, which is in charge of the military hospital, and the Ministry of Interior have been refusing to give any information on his situation or to allow access to him.
So we just don't know what's happened this week then?
No, we don't.
We know he's still alive though, do we?
We don't know that either. Frontline Defenders, which is the organization that my father used to work with, have put out an appeal that the Bahrain government give at least proof of life to the family, just so that we know that he's alive. And it does not make sense that they would refuse any kind of interaction with him, because they know that if we have evidence that he's still alive, then we will say that internationally, and it will stop some of the pressure that is ongoing, because we currently do not know whether he's still alive or not.
And if today, in this terribly difficult situation, he managed to get a message to you, Maryam, to say, do you want me to continue with this hunger strike and die, or do you want me to give up this hunger strike and live? What would you say to your father?
I would say to him exactly what he would say to me if I had asked him the same question. Do what is in the best interest of the people of Bahrain. What is in the best interest of freedom and justice and the struggle to reach those two things.
Those two things, yeah. What is the situation in Bahrain at the moment? As we heard, you know, obviously the Grand Prix went ahead, but is there still as much protest, or has the protest softened a little?
Well, the protests have been ongoing almost on a nightly basis since February 14th, 2011. They never stopped. The international media, unfortunately, just stopped covering them. The same violations that we've been documenting and reporting on for the past year are still continuous today. And in some cases, they've even gotten worse since the BICI report. We've documented cases of extrajudicial killings. We've documented cases of systematic excessive use of force against protesters. We've documented cases of torture, cases of arbitrary arrests, house raids without warrants. So the same things that we've been talking about for a year, despite the continuous promises of reforms made by the Bahraini government, are still continuing. And I think one of the most alarming things are the cases of the children who are being either tortured or kidnapped or arrested, and the fact that there are still around 700 political prisoners in Bahrain.
And what's the level of fatalities in the last year, since last February or March?
Well, the amount of fatalities after the documentation that was done with the BICI report are actually more than those documented in the report itself. Since January alone, we've had more than 20 cases of people dying from what is said to be the cause of tear gas suffocation. Most of them were killed inside their homes. The way that the Bahraini government uses tear gas is that they go into the villages that are known for protesting, usually in the evening or in the night, and they will excessively shoot tear gas into residential areas and into people's homes, which has caused suffocations. And they will also aim tear gas at people's heads, which has in the past couple of months killed 2 14-year-old boys by being shot at point-blank range in the head with a tear gas canister.
Tell me, what do you think happens next? What will you ask for from the rest of the world, from those countries who support your rights position and so on? What would you like them to do that you think they might do?
Well, I think that unfortunately the Gulf region in general has been for too long looked at as being an area of only monarchies, and the populations are usually overlooked. And I think it's about time that we realize here in the West that actually there are populations that exist in these Gulf countries, and there are populations that want freedom and democracy and justice just as much as anyone else in the world. And just because those monarchies are oil rich does not mean that the populations there don't deserve the kind of support that people do in Syria or in Egypt or in Tunisia or anywhere else. And unfortunately today, because of the arms sales that are happening between Bahrain and the United States of America and the United Kingdom and France and other countries, unfortunately these countries who are criticizing Russia for selling arms to Syria today are the very same countries who are selling arms to Bahrain. And the situation is right now that these countries, the United States, the UK, France and others, are to Bahrain what Russia is to Syria. And I think we're at a point where we've realized that there is a very obvious double standard when dealing with the different countries of the so-called Arab Spring. And also that the fact that some countries, they will criticize or have constant and consistent statements about some situations, while as they won't even move a finger when it comes to other countries, as if, we're still living in an age where a barrel of oil sold by Saudi Arabia to the Western countries is more valuable than the lives of the Bahraini people. We're going to see change in Bahrain come, whether people like it or not, around the world. But it's going to come through two ways. It's either going to be a very long and bloody process where people will have to continue protesting for a very, very long time until they can force change to come about, or it can come in the form of international pressure. Unfortunately, if we continue to see a situation where people in Bahrain feel like they've been ignored by the international community, or when they feel like the government of Bahrain is being supported by the international community to continue committing the human rights violations that they do on a daily basis, then I fear that we are pushing, as being part of the West, as an EU citizen, I feel that we are pushing the population in Bahrain towards what we say is our worst fear, which is towards Iran and towards other powers who may be more willing to help them out.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed, Maryam. And if, obviously, we'll make available, we would accept a senior member of the government, Bahraini government, joining us next week. If they will, would you be prepared to appear with them wherever you are, from wherever you are? Would you appear with a senior member of the government?
I am prepared to meet and talk and debate anyone from the government, whether it's the king or a employee in the government, because we have the facts and we have the numbers and we have the cases, and so there's nothing to hide, and the cases are very easy to present and document. When it comes to human rights, there is no gray area. There's black and white, and the government is either doing the right thing or the wrong thing, and unfortunately in Bahrain the government has chosen to do the wrong thing.
Maryam, thank you very much. We'll get back to you if there's a possible meeting in next week's programme. And for the moment, however, we thank you very much for that very cogent report of the situation as you see it. Thank you very much indeed, Maryam.
Thank you.
And now, the Maldives. Serving as president of the Maldives from 2008 until February of this year, Mohamed Nasheed was forced to resign amidst violent protests and under disputed circumstances. Joining me now, we welcome Mohamed Nasheed. Welcome, Mohamed. There are various reports on your resignation. Some say it was legitimate, but you say it was absolutely an act of force. Is that right?
If there ever was a coup anywhere else, I'm sure this was a coup, and this was the first televised coup in the Maldives. All transfers of power in the Maldives until 2008 were violent. But we had our first multi-party elections in 2008, and we were able to have a smooth transfer of power at that instant. But this time around, and 3.5 years into that, this is what has happened. On the 6th of February, the chief of police rang me and gave me an account of events of what was happening. 2 battalions of riot police, without control and without command, left the barracks, went into our assembly hall. They attacked our party supporters and sacked the place. And then they came in front of the military headquarters, and they sat there and they called for the resignation of the chief of police and myself. So I went into the military headquarters. This is 5 o'clock on the 7th of February. And I found the place to be almost deserted. There were only 200 people in there. All the generals were not in their uniforms, and everyone apparently was on leave. The 200 people inside the military headquarters, and out of even that, a good half of them wanted to join with the mutinous police.
You've called for early elections. I mean, elections are currently scheduled for July 2013. Is that right?
Now, if we give more time to the police and the military, they would get a better grip on power, and I'm afraid we will not have an election in 2013. We are moving into a Burma situation where there cannot be any elections at all, and that would be such a misfortune to the people of the Maldives. They want democracy restored in the Maldives, and we must have elections in 2013. I hope that governments would impress upon the government in the Maldives the need for that. We are not talking about, we are not talking about my presidency, but we are talking about democracy in the Maldives, and the people of the Maldives must be governed by elected leaders, not by a government formulated through brute force.
There's currently a warrant for your arrest. What's the charge against you?
The charge against me, apparently they found empty bottles of wine in the labor quarters of the president's residence, and they are accusing me of having emptied them, having drunk them.
Why was it that the international community, particularly your supporters, President Obama and Hillary Clinton, were so quick to voice their support for the new presidency and the new president? That was a surprise to you, wasn't it?
Well, it was a surprise and it was a shock. For instance, the British government is still not recognizing the regime in the Maldives. The European Union is the same. The Commonwealth is asking for an inquiry and elections in 2012. But we are finding that the United States was lagging behind until I went to the US, and then I spoke to the State Department in the United States. And we now see that they have, in a sense, recalibrated their position to align more with what is happening on the ground.
Mohamed Wahid Hassan, who was your vice president, is now the president. Do you think he's doing a good and enlightened job or not?
Well, I think, Dr. Wahid is a facade to Qayyum. As I see it, the former dictator is back in power. He's got all his children in the cabinet. He's got all his associates, cronies, and all the regime people that he had in 2008, now again back in the government. So in my mind, Dr. Wahid is not the central issue here, but Qayyum.
And I read from your past, before you became president, that in fact at that time you were imprisoned and tortured on many occasions by the previous Qayyum regime. Do you feel there is a danger again of that happening, since you are living there in the Maldives and opposing the current government as you oppose the Qayyum one?
Well, they've already beaten me up once, and they have these charges on me, and I'm sure they would like to see me arrested, and they're working on it. I'm very, very worried about it. And the heavy-handed manners and policies are back again.
So what is your immediate ambition then? What do you want to see? What changes do you want to see to the current government's policies?
Well, the current government is illegitimate. We don't want them there. The people of the Maldives must decide who should rule upon, who should govern upon them. And, right now, the dispensation was formulated through brute force, and this is not an illegitimate government. So we must have elections as quickly as possible.
Mohamed Nasheed, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And now to one of the most intransigent moral problems of modern times. How does society deal lawfully with a lawless? This question first raised its head after the Second World War, of course, when the Allies debated how to treat Nazi war criminals. 70 years later, the same question is being asked of al-Qaeda terror suspects held in Western detention. What courts are appropriate for them? Or for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, in particular, the architect of the September 11th attacks, whose trial on charges of terrorism and conspiracy is about to open in Guantanamo. Author William Shawcross joins me now to discuss his new book, Justice and the Enemy. William, welcome.
Lovely to be here.
Thank you. Just underline for one moment the family interest in this area of justice and your father's role in Nuremberg.
Yes, my father was called Hartley Shawcross, and he was Attorney General immediately after the Second World War. And as such, he was sent to Nuremberg by the government to be the chief British prosecutor of the Nazi War Crimes Tribunal. There were prosecutors from America, the Soviet Union, France, and Britain, and he was the British prosecutor. And I remember very much in the 1950s the legacy of Nuremberg, if you like, and I used to listen to old 78 RPM recordings of his speeches to the tribunal, of witness statements of mass murders of Jews in the Ukraine and so on, which filled me with a dark sort of horror, if you like, at my father was recounting, and those images and those problems have remained with me thereafter.
And what are the contrasts or the similarities between the two events? I mean, they're very different in many different ways, but I mean, in terms of justice itself.
Well, it's very interesting because there was everyone thinks now that Nuremberg is a given, and it was, but there was a big debate at the end of the war as to what should happen to the Nazis that we captured, the Nazi leaders. Stalin wanted to execute 100,000 German officers. Or any Germans, actually, just as long as it was a huge number, sort of revenge. Churchill thought that a trial would be very inconvenient and unpredictable. He thought the top 10 Nazis whom we captured from Hitler on down should be given summary justice, basically, and put up against a wall and shot. Roosevelt took a very different view. He came to the conclusion that a trial must be the only sensible way forward. And he died shortly before the end of the war, sadly, in April 1945. But Truman, his successor, agreed. And the Americans said, we must have a trial. And the British were rather reluctantly brought along. And all through the summer of 1945, the four victorious allies negotiated how to do this trial. And it was difficult because the Russians, of course, have no sense of justice in the sense that we, the communist Russia, didn't, in the sense that we did. But eventually, in the course of the summer of 1945, an agreement was made in London, it's called the London Charter, to stage a trial in Nuremberg. And it opened with astonishing speed. The war ended in May 1945, and the trial started in October 1945. And it was finished by the following July. Nowadays, trials go on forever. We just saw in The Hague the trial of Mr. Taylor from Liberia, and that took 5 years, I think. In Nuremberg, it was a matter of months.
And will this trial of Sheikh Mohammed, I mean, will that take this amount of time? And for the people who think it's really unfair that it's a military trial, I mean, what do you say about that?
Well, I think it will take much longer because the modern justice is very, very slow because there's all sorts of suits and countersuits and so on. As for the military trial, it's a very interesting and important question. What I think a simple way of explaining it, and somewhat surprising way of explaining it, is that if any Nazi in the dock in Nuremberg was suddenly transported by time machine to Guantanamo, he would be overjoyed by the extraordinary extra rights he suddenly had. In Nuremberg, there was no right of appeal, for example. The judgment of the tribunal was final. They had 22 Nazis on trial, and I think 12 of them were sentenced to death, 7 to long terms of prison, and 2 or 3 were released innocent. But there was no appeal against that. In Guantanamo, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, if he wants to, and if he is convicted, can appeal all the way up through the civilian criminal system in America to the Supreme Court. So that's a fantastic safeguard. Moreover, in Guantanamo, there are all the human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the American Civil Liberties Union. All these people are working very hard on behalf of the detainees in Guantanamo.
What about the question of torture in general? Is it compatible with the fundamental rights of man? There was one quote where you said defending torture is a natural response to the most urgent problems of terrorism. And you're very concerned about the urgent problems of terrorism, but are you too gentle on torture?
I don't think so, no. I say it's a hugely difficult dilemma. I mean, there is an argument, of course, whether waterboarding is torture. Yeah. Many people think it is. The Justice Department under George Bush said it was not torture, that it was just tough interrogation. And the sort of interrogation that Britain used against the IRA, not waterboarding, but we used other forms of tough interrogation in the 1970s, and they were ruled permissible at the time by the European Court of Justice. But waterboarding would not have been ruled permissible, there's no question about that. Anyway, there is a debate as to whether that's torture. It's a terribly difficult question. It's the sort of, the cliche is the ticking bomb scenario. If you have arrested somebody and you know that he has put a ticking bomb in the center of Cairo or in the center of Beirut or in the center of London or in New York, and you've got an hour or a day to get that information out of him, what do you do? And that's the dilemma of leaders. And one of the things I quoted is that any leader who feels that he has to torture for that sort of reason is stained forever. It's something that he will never, a blemish that he will never get rid of. And that certainly happened to George Bush.
Thank you very much, William. Thank you for being with us. In a minute, the internationally celebrated actress Kristen Scott Thomas after the break.